Hello and welcome to the first in a series of videos which will examine historical figures from the medieval world and explain the influence they have had on HBO's Game of Thrones and George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire. This is the first episode in the series and will focus on one of the Yorkist kings to rule medieval England, Edward IV. Edward was born in the Roine in France in 1442, which was English territory gained during the 100 Years' War. Edward was the eldest of 4 sons to Richard the Duke of York. The House of York claimed their lineage from Edward III and had a strong claim to the English crown. Richard the Duke of York was the leading Yorkist in a dynastical struggle known as the Wars of the Roses. This civil war was very long and brutal. During it, cousin fought against cousin and brother betrayed brother, all in the hope of carrying favour with the winning side. The Wars of the Roses would inspire the War of the Five Kings. George himself has spoken of how House York inspired House Stark and House Lancaster inspired House Lannister. At the Battle of Wakefield, Richard, Duke of York, died, and Edward would take up his claim. With the help of Richard, the Kingmaker Neville, Earl of Warwick, Edward was launch a campaign for the English crown. He was also helped by the fact that Margaret of Anjou, the leader of the Lancastrian opposition, had made herself so hated by filling her army with Scottish barbarians that the city of London remained closed to her as she was refused entry at Moorgate. At this time, Moorgate was an actual gate, and it was shut because the army had plundered its way from Wakefield, and the Londoners were too scared to admit them to the city. By this time, Edward could quickly march on London, and they had no choice to accept him for their king. Edward won a series of victories that culminated in the Battle of Towton near York in 1461, which meant the whole of the Lancastrian army had been crushed, and Edward was the unanimous King of England. After a few years as king, Edward and Warwick began to fall out. This was due to the growing influence of Edward's wife, Elizabeth Woodville, whose political prowess and ambition in promoting her own family led to resentment between Warwick and Edward, and resulted in Edward having to flee England when Warwick sought to restore Lancaster to the throne. Woodville and Anjou go on to inspire a lot of the female characters in Game of Thrones, and this will be a focus of one of the later episodes. Richard Neville was also one of the most fascinating characters in British medieval history. Like many people in the Game of Thrones universe, he was made up of equal and good in both parts, and I hope to do an episode on him in a later series. On 2 separate occasions did Richard Neville hold the King of England in his custody. Once, Edward IV, during their fallout, but before, when he was campaigning with Edward, Henry VI was his prisoner. He well earned the nickname, the Kingmaker. Nevertheless, after spending some time exiled in Flanders, Edward returned to defeat Warwick at the Battle of Barnet in 1471. He then rushed to Tewkesbury near Gloucester to crush the rest of the Lancastrian forces before they could regroup in Wales. The character who Edward has had the most influence on in the world of Ice and Fire is Robert Baratheon. Both men were able to inspire leadership and loyalty, and they were both fearsome warriors. My favourite fact about Edward is the average height of a man during his time was 5'2" to 5'7", and Edward was 6'4". Now imagine being clad in steel and swinging a sword around. You would rather follow this giant than face him. They even share similar battle tactics. Both men were famous for gaining a quick march on their enemies by moving their armies from place to place in shorter times than any other commander. As Robert marched quickly to defeat 3 armies in a single day at Summerhall, Edward's relatively easy victory at Tewkesbury was possible because of how quickly he marched on Margaret of Anjou after defeating Warwick at Barnet. They both also loved a drink. Although Robert and Edward were great warriors and won kingdoms because of it, ruling bored them. They both drank, whored, and hunted, even during the birth of their children. These failures would lead to resentment for the pair, and both would be called usurper by their enemies till the end of their days. A younger Edward IV shares similar characteristics with Robb Stark. Both would go to war after their father was beheaded and claim a kingship because of it. They both, rather impressively, never lost a battle, despite starting their military careers at a very young age. So that's it for Edward IV, who was a fascinating character from British medieval history, and to whom fans and the Game of Thrones universe owes a lot too. Join me next week when I will discuss the similarities between John of Gaunt and Tywin Lannister.